Let's talk about setting the context. Now, the references for this are the ISO standard 42010. That is a standard to do with software architecture descriptions. It's not a standard for software architectures. It's a standard for the architecture descriptions or architecture documentation. It was based on the IEEE standard 1471. And now, the deal with IEEE and ISO is that IEEE can quite happily develop a technical standard. They'll give it to ISO, who usually try to modify a certain amount of it, and then it is ported back to IEEE, and then from then on it's maintained in parallel. Other references, Bass, Clements and Casman, in software architecture and practice, do describe something about how you document architecture, so that's a pretty good reference as well. The context of an architecture description, that diagram is from the standard 42010. The reason for the 42 number is that this group who developed the standard had a sense of humour. They also were Pink Floyd fans. And working groups in the ISO committees get a number, and they wanted the number 42 from Life at the End of the Universe, or The Restaurant at the End of the Universe, where the answer to everything was 42, but we didn't know what the question was. So they picked the number 42 as their working group and managed to reserve the block of numbers from the International Standards Community for the 42,000 series. So all of their standards are 42,000 something. So just a bit of weird history. The connection to Pink Floyd is they put the Pink Floyd Dark Side of the Moon album logo on their standards as well. At least they're working documents, you can't put it on a published standard. Back to the context. The context of an architecture description, they have it there. They're interested in the system concerns, the environment of it all. Now, I have said previously in this lecture that the context of an architecture should include the stakeholders and their objectives, the constraints and the risks. Now, that's pretty much the same as this, where the architecture is an architecture in a context, and it's necessary that the documentation records that context so that people do understand why the architecture is the way it is. It is the way it is because it's suited to that context. The architecture documentation, pretty much everything from the architecture documentation should have identification. It's really, really important. What am I looking at? Which version is it? So it should identify the system of interest, which version, and any other information specified by the organization. And the usual information block includes not only the version, but who has approved it and what stage it's at, because it could be in draft and not approved, or it could be approved, when was it approved, all that information. Stakeholders and their concerns. This is nothing new, you should have done this before. We identify the stakeholders, as many as seem to be important. We identify their concerns about the system of interest, and this is the functional concerns, the functional objectives, and their non-functional objectives. These are their concerns. We consider, as stakeholders, the users, the operators, the acquirers, the owners, the suppliers, developers, maintainers. Any more? Regulators? That would probably be enough. You might split the developer into the developers managers or the developers organization, but developers can encompass all those. Narrative architecture description. There usually is or should be a short narrative description of what the system's function is, who its users are, and any important background or constraints. The intent is to provide readers with a mental model of the system and its purpose. We need to create the context in the mind of the person looking at the documentation. So the more efficiently we can do that, the better. Sometimes the project at large will have a system overview, in which case the section documentation is where it applies. There will be a summary. There should be a summary. In any architecture of any size that has multiple views, viewpoints, and diagrams all over the place, we will have to have a summary. And the context for the architecture description identifies the description itself, the stakeholders and their concerns, and a summary narrative about the system. So we summarize all that. It's kind of like the introduction of the overview, the executive summary, if you will, that we stick in front of it and say, here's what we're dealing with, here's what you're looking at.